it's appropriate, I think, to begin a discussion of interpreting history through three-dimensional objects by going to the source. And to that end, I have brought a real live artifact that I hope that I can use as a vehicle for getting us into understanding how artifacts can be used to interpret history. You will, I hope, recognize this artifact as a spur. And I would just like to ask the question, how do you know it's what you think it is? Think on that for a minute while I give you some ideas. Someone probably told you that this was a spur to start out with. Perhaps you have one in your own museum, or you have seen one in another museum. Maybe you've seen one in a picture in a book, or perhaps on cowboys and TV, movies, or whatever. Perhaps you're a horse person yourself and have had personal experience with this particular artifact. Whatever your frame of reference, I think, you're probably aware of the functional use of this artifact as a motivator of horseflesh. But beyond that, what can we really ascertain just by looking at this inanimate object? What could we say, for example, about this particular artifact's qualities? Is it durable? Is it beautiful? And what might be said about this artifact in terms of how it reflects the relative availability of horses during the time in which it was in use? Or perhaps the state of the art in breaking and training horses. I think that you can get at least a feel for that just by looking at this particular object. Of course, there are other things. One might, what would you think about the ownership of horses based on a person who was wearing this? If you were the owner of a horse, would you be interested in someone mounting your animal with a spur like this? And what observations might you make about the horsemen themselves? Obviously, it would be a little difficult to get off your horse and walk around any great length of time with one of these on. You would end up plowing a furrow, I think. And consequently, a little further investigation would lead you to know that people who wore these didn't get off their mounts very often, and when they did, of course, they could take them off. Does this artifact also give you clues as to the status or to the values of the owner of this artifact, or perhaps the maker of this artifact? Or even, is it reflective of the culture that produced it? I think so. I think that this artifact embodies a lot of deeper meanings and values that we can ascertain. Political values, social values, economic values, environmental considerations, perhaps even some religious values, some aesthetic values I think one can see just by an examination of this particular artifact. And our initial impressions of it will, of course, be either confirmed or denied by what amount of research we might be able to do on the object. And if we were to have the full benefit from that, we would know that this particular artifact was known as an Espuela Grande, the Great Spur, which was worn by Hispanic horsemen between 1500 and 1700 in not only Spain but also Mexico and the American Southwest. If you were to check the accession records for this object, you would understand that it was found in an archaeological excavation near the town of San Antonio along a trade route which was well traveled by Spanish missionaries and explorers and settlers and soldiers. And therefore it represents probably a real link between the modern day and the Hispanic past, which was Texas beginning in 1690. This spur is part of what a museologist, Albert E. Parr, has called history stage settings. That is, stage settings without the actors or the scripts. And in deference to the conservation people, I'll put this down and also get rid of the gloves. We'll talk a little bit more about artifacts. I mentioned their history stage settings. Museum people, historians, people who study artifacts call them material culture, part of material culture. That's been defined as the totality of objects that man has either made or adapted for his own use. Some people have expanded this definition to include not only things such as tools, but things even further out in terms of thought, domestic animals as material culture, and language as material culture. All of these, I think, are valid. Regardless, it should be obvious now that the study of what we're calling material culture, or three-dimensional objects, and I've never really seen a two-dimensional object. Think about that. Actually, we use the term three-dimensional object to differentiate it from flat media such as graphics and photographs and documents for the purposes of what we're talking about. Lest you still be skeptical that the study of objects is a principal inquiry, or should be a principal inquiry in the study of history, let me relate to you a favorite passage of mine from John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. You'll recall when the Joad family was preparing to leave their Oklahoma farm for California during the height of the Depression. They had sold off all of their goods that would bring $1, and those which they deemed an absolute necessity had been tied on their vehicles in haphazard fashion sometimes, and they had piled the rest of their goods in the front yard. The women sat among the doomed things, Steinbeck tells us, looking past them and back. This book, my father had it. He liked a book, Pilgrim's Progress. He used to read it. Got his name in it. In his pipe, it still smells rank. In this picture, an angel. I looked at that before the first three come, but it didn't seem to do much good. Think we could get this China dog in? Aunt Sadie brought it from the St. Louis Fair. See, wrote right on it. No, I guess not. Here's a letter my brother wrote the day before he died. And here's an old-time hat. These feathers, never got to use them. No, there isn't room. But how can we live without our lives? How will we know it's us without our past? I think we can all easily identify with the feelings that the Joads displayed toward a feather hat, a book, a China dog, a picture of an angel. There are similar objects of importance to us in our own lives, objects that are dear and objects that evoke emotions that far surpass and have greater value than any functional significance that they might have. And it is this power of artifacts to stimulate and provoke that we as interpreters hope to harness and effectively use in our presentations. It is why our visitors enter our doors. And artifacts are among the most versatile of all the remains of our past, because they can convey information which may be comprehended by almost everyone, regardless of what age, handicap, or educational level one might have. The same cannot always be said of the printed media, photographs, graphics, printed word, or whatever. Unfortunately, we as interpreters often don't show very much confidence at the artifacts at our disposal. Too often we've been either content to merely display or forced to display for one reason or another our collections rather than to really interpret them. And although a simple display of objects where they're just laid out there for all to see has some merit, it is the experience that we have with artifacts and what we can learn from them that really makes formal interpretation really the key to fully exploiting the potential that artifacts have. Hopefully I've demonstrated to you with a simple exercise concerning the spur that we can learn a great deal from artifacts merely by observation, and if we do a little bit of research we can learn even more. Yet it is often difficult for us to deal with the inanimate objects and inanimate evidence of our past. Now, as children, this was not nearly such a problem for us. I mean, we grasped at mobiles and we squeezed fingers, and we somehow made sense out of our world, even though we couldn't read or write. And then somewhere on our great road to maturity, as we learn these skills, we put away childish things and we forget how to really observe and use our senses and get in touch with our feelings. And as such, then we lose sympathy for artifacts and the things around us. And these must be really relearned in order for us to have sympathy with the objects. Of course, tactile and visual skills are not an end to themselves. Objects cannot and should not be interpreted in a vacuum. Indeed, there is reason to evaluate them, to analyze them, to compare them, to classify them, to relate and interpret them if they are to really have meaning. And methods for their study need to be developed in order for us to do this satisfactorily. Unfortunately, such methods have. Previously, however, the responsibility for developing methods of dealing with artifacts and to drawing the information, reading artifacts, if you will, has really come from and been in the province of antiquarians rather than historians. And it was the archaeologists and the folklorists and the art historians really who pioneered the understanding of artifacts, and historians have only recently come to conclusions that they are an important source of evidence. In fact, it may be argued that they are maybe a more democratic source of evidence than are documents and things that have been produced by writing and speaking. To assist us in developing our skills in studying or reading artifacts, several models, as I mentioned, have been developed. One of the most complex is that developed by E. McClung Fleming, who has produced a number of works on artifacts as cultural and social documents, particularly furniture. According to Fleming, every artifact has 5 properties. These are a history, that is, who, what, when, and where, and how. They have a material, or what they're made of. They have a construction, which is how they're made. They have a design element, which includes decoration and iconography. And then they have a function, which involves both intended uses and unintended uses. Now, he proposes that we can apply 4 operations to each of these different properties that an artifact has. The first thing he says is we can identify an object's history, its material, construction, design, and function. And this is merely a factual description which can be obtained by observation or laboratory analysis, such as can be seen through this particular slide concerning a group of shipwreck artifacts which are under laboratory analysis after being brought up from the ocean bottom. Secondly, he says that artifacts can be evaluated. Their properties may be evaluated. This involves judgments, which are usually aesthetical about an object's history and material, etc. These are often obtained by comparing them to like objects or objects that are somewhat similar. Thirdly, one can make cultural analyses of an artifact's properties. How does the artifact relate to the culture that produced it? They can create a context using related aspects of that culture. You've seen period rooms, such as the one from the 1890s parlor, which you see in the slide. Very illustrative of exhibits in which the individual artifacts are placed in a context and are examined culturally. The fourth operation which Fleming proposes is interpretation. In interpretation, conclusions concerning the significance of an object to that culture are developed, and potential interpretations may be several. They may vary with your own personal views, with that of class, ideology, natural interests, audience. Whatever, one must, above all, attempt as nearly as possible to understand the significance of that artifact with respect to its own culture, and not impose some sort of artificial criteria on it. Well, Fleming's model illustrates the depth to which artifacts can be studied and subjected to scholarly scrutiny. He provides an admirable, though complex, standard of inquiry to which we may all aspire. Its successful application, however, requires a good bit of experience and time. There's another method of reading artifacts that has been suggested by Fred Schroeder in an AASLH technical leaflet entitled Designing Your Exhibit, 7 Ways to Look at an Artifact. And I think that this brief work is a good place to start whenever you're considering the basics of artifacts. Basically, Schroeder proposes developing an understanding of objects in the following ways. First, reading it with the senses. This involves not only visual contact, but also touch and hearing and smell. And handling artifacts really helps us to become personally involved with them And that's one reason why touching exhibits are so popular and so interesting to our visitors. If one were to run his hands across the surface of the carreta, which you see in the slide before you, you would not only get splinters, but you would also get a feel for the rough-hewenness of the surface as created by rather primitive tools that were used to produce it. If you were to get close to the axle near the hub, you might actually be able to come up with some remnants of the axle grease and thereby gain an understanding of not only how it feels but how it smells. Likewise, if you were able to pull this carreta out of the museum and pull it any length of time, you would more than understand what early travelers who traveled with long caravans of these vehicles heard and experienced the whole day as they heard the creaking and howling of the wheels and how they could be heard from miles away. There is a natural tendency which attracts us to these sensory experiences, I think. As I've already stated, the sensory exploration is one of the principal ways that children learn, but opportunities to experience artifacts and other modes, or modes other than visually, are also important to handicapped learners. Determining the function of an artifact is Schroeder's second way of looking at an artifact. It may also be a sensory experience, or it may be a kinesthetic experience, which involves actually trying to use the object. You may also be able to understand the concept of obsoleteness by determining the function of an object or why it's no longer used. And the use of certain objects in a lot of ways suggests relationships between artifacts. The flat irons that you see, for example, in this slide can eventually be connected with things such as stoves and fuel and clothing. The third method which Schroeder proposes is to understand the environment or context in which the artifact was used. And again, our example is the period room, this time a general store. It's particularly important that we consider the context of historical artifacts because they're taken out of context and when they're brought into the museum. And we need to at least intellectually reestablish this context for our visitors. Artifacts can also be considered as they developed through time, which is the fourth way of looking at an artifact, as Professor Schroeder indicates. This method relates similar objects using a time dimension of either a chronology which is either well established or one which you more or less arbitrarily through research establish. Such is the case with this saddle exhibit which you see, the saddles being arranged chronologically, and one can make comparisons and details of design, construction, technology fairly effectively by having the chronology spread out in front of you. Fifthly, artifacts can be examined cross-culturally by making comparisons, provided that an artifact has a counterpart in another culture. A good example could be the comparison of horse equipment of the Southern Plains Indians, for example, with that of other horsemen, perhaps Americans. You'll see some similarities and some differences in this slide. You'll see, for example, that the saddle differs considerably from the Western stock saddle and Eastern American versions, but the ring bit is not unlike the Spanish ring bits which were used by Europeans, and that's a simple explanation for that. It was a trade item. Sixthly, one can examine artifacts in terms of what influenced their design and construction. The objects which you see in this slide concerning the Comanche culture may be helpful in helping us understand this. They reflect a variety of influences, including environment, religion, aesthetics, and culture. Symbolism is also involved in these, as well as other artifacts that you'll see. The most abstract way, however, of looking at artifacts, as suggested by Dr. Schroeder, is that an artifact can be examined in terms of its meanings or values, those which it embodies. It's a very abstract approach, and it requires a good deal of creativity and understanding, but it also is very rewarding when one comes to these insights. Artifacts such as those referred to in the previous discussion of the Joad family certainly embodied important values. This Confederate flag, which symbolizes a rebellious spirit and a yearning for freedom, is another. Our understanding of the deeper meanings of these values will so often depend on our experience with them I may not be affected by the Confederate flag as someone who had fought for the South, for example, might be. Likewise, as a more personal example, we have the war bonnet and beaded lance of the Comanche chief Quanah Parker in our museum, the Panhandle Plains Museum. And I, of course, have understood the story of Quanah Parker through in time, and these artifacts mean a great deal to me. And undoubtedly they mean a great deal to a lot of the school children who come in who do study that in school. But one day as we were walking through our exhibit halls, we noticed a young man in our Southern Plains Indian case, a young Native American Comanche, who was standing next to the case in which Quanah's beaded lance and his bonnet were in, and he had his hands on the glass and he was chanting. And of course we waited until he got finished, and we engaged him in a discussion. It turns out he was a Comanche on his search for manhood, and he had come in to draw the power from Quanah's lance and bonnet. And to him, he had really internalized what these meant. And of course, we had a different level of experience with the artifact, or were seeking a different level of meaning. And this just points up the great variety and flexibility, and our artifacts can affect our visitors in ways which we can't even fathom and understand. Likewise, there are any number of other objects that meet important needs. Art objects are one that comes to mind. They need little interpretation. In most cases, it is left to the viewer to decide what is meant and what is to be felt. The work itself encourages the viewer to make those kinds of judgments. More and more artifacts are beginning to be seen as art, folk art. These moccasins, for example, that you see in this particular slide, have great value in a historical exhibit, but they're very beautiful, and their designs are in great variety, and they offer us some aesthetic pleasure as well as historical understanding. For most artifacts, however, the deep meanings of artifacts lie dormant and uncommunicated to the average museum visitor. When this happens, it's usually our fault as interpreters, because it should be our mission to reveal some of these meanings to our visitors in such a way that will really excite and inspire them, our visitors, to want to know more. Our artifacts really are the heart of museum interpretation. They're the primary means by which we teach, in which we entertain, in which we stimulate. And as such, the museum's collection will in large measure determine the exhibit topics and themes that can be supported. Now, there are two basic approaches to exhibit interpretation which rely on their artifacts as their foundation. The first is the object approach, and both of these are laid out in Edward P. Alexander's work, Museum in Motion. Basically, using the object approach, a group of artifacts suggests certain themes around which an exhibit can be built. A group of hats, for example, might suggest sub-themes related to personality, occupation, fashion, regionalism, or status. What exhibit themes, for example, might be drawn from a group of pocket watches like this one? Or consider this group of food containers. Could an effective exhibit be built around them? It may be helpful at this point to recall the 7 ways that, or the other methodologies which we talked about in terms of reading artifacts. The second major way of approaching exhibit interpretation has been characterized as the idea approach. That is, you have an idea and you go out and gather artifacts to support that idea and its various sub-themes. You may, for example, want to interpret the life of children in America during the late 19th century, and you would go out and select certain artifacts which would reflect various aspects or themes of the story, some perhaps related to recreation, to education, to clothing, to role models. There are almost an infinite number. The same process could be used to develop an exhibit around almost any theme or topic, that using the idea approach. It's often helpful when approaching an exhibit and considering artifacts and themes to have some sort of organization using a storyboard or a script or an outline to help you get organized and help you identify and match your exhibits with the appropriate themes. A couple have been suggested. One in Armetta Neal's book, Help for the Small Museum, is particularly helpful, I think, and also Peter Welch has suggested one in an ASLH technical leaflet entitled Ordering Your Artifacts Interpretively. Basically, all you need to do is divide a sheet of paper into 3 parts and put your topics that you plan to handle and the artifacts that you plan to use to handle the topics, and then the exhibit method, whether it be photographs or whatever that you might want to use in your interpretation. And that is a very simple way to handle the organizational process. But I would encourage each and every one of you to go through the process of planning, because proper planning prevents poor performances, I used to hear in the Army. When formulating an interpretive scheme and pondering the best use of artifacts in an exhibit, a few of the following considerations may be helpful. One, your artifacts ought to be chosen because they're appropriate. They ought to be appropriate to your museum purpose. They ought to be in good taste. Skeletal material, such as you see here in an exhibit, and religious artifacts related to Native Americans are very sensitive subjects and are not in good taste. And one needs to at least go through this thought process before deciding to exhibit a given artifact. Our artifacts should also be selected because they depend on objects which best portray or convey the values which we are trying to produce and have the best chance of attracting our visitors and helping them internalize the exhibit experience. The spur, I think, was an excellent example of a very dramatic kind of artifact that does that very well. Artifacts throughout it all should be the focal point of the museum exhibit. Let them be enhanced, but don't let them be overwhelmed by exhibit design or other interpretive media such as labeling or photographs or graphics. Nevertheless, let your artifacts be used flexibly and creative in conjunction with labeling and photographs and documents and those sorts of things. Bear in mind that artifacts are not always the best media for conveying some concepts. A map might be much better in conveying the idea of a boundary line, for example, than an artifact ever could. Flexibility may also entail the use of several different type artifacts at different places within an exhibit to illustrate a variety of different meanings. In most cases, artifacts will be chosen or should be chosen because they're representative and typical, and this is often a problem because sometimes only the best cared for artifacts or examples survive. The most durable also. Spurs, for example, survive in greater quantity as cowboy artifacts than do hats or vests or other clothing. Likewise, wedding dresses are far more prevalent in collections than everyday work clothes. And finally, interpreters ought to attempt to reestablish, insofar as possible, the original context of an artifact or group of artifacts. Otherwise, our visitors may never really make the connections that we hope that they will make when they look at our artifacts as they are presented in themes. The situation is not unlike the story that I heard and I'm very fond of the little girl in school who announced boldly to her teacher that she was going to draw a picture of God. And her teacher said, "But Mary, no one knows what God looks like." And she said, "They will when I get through." And I think that's the challenge of all interpreters, and I hope if I can leave that with you, I hope they will know when you get through exactly what you hope to say. Thank you.